Hi, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience. And today I want to talk about some really amazing progress in the world of prostheses. And so, something cool about this specific article is that the innovations and the progress that have both been published in a very highly regarded scientific journal have also been published in a popular press outlet called Stat News. So by the way, if you're unfamiliar with Stat News and you have any interest in science, biomedical science, I highly recommend checking it out. They're the best outlet covering biomedical science right now. Anyway, so we're talking about prosthetics today, or prostheses. And in case you're unfamiliar with that term, that refers to the use of an artificial device to compensate for the loss of a part of the body. So, for example, you can see this runner has those honestly like kind of cool looking prosthetic blades to enable her to run very, very effectively. In fact, so effectively that some assessments of the comparison of runners with these prosthetic legs to runners without them suggest that there are actually some competitive advantages due to the mechanical properties of the blades themselves. And so this was a debate that was going on, about a decade ago. And because of some of the specific people involved in the debate, it sort of veered in an unrelated direction. But anyway, so the notion that prostheses, prosthetics or prostheses might actually deliver superior human performance is a discussion that I find fascinating. I don't think it's entirely controversial to suggest that there is a universe where there will be some superior capabilities associated with prosthetics. But that is not the topic for today. So today we're talking about some remarkable progress that's been made towards developing prosthetic devices that deliver some significant capability. And so this is a team based out of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the best hospitals in the country, in the world, and Harvard Medical School. Certainly some of the leading biomedical institutions in the world, right? And this is honestly the kind of innovation that we sort of dream might result from, the collaboration between engineers and biologists and physicians. Hey, what's up? What's that? Yeah, hey, what's up, 2B Kelly? Thanks for hopping in. And so some pretty cool collaborations going on here. And so, obviously people have confronted the loss of limbs for a very long time, of course, right? Particularly when people suffer, the loss of a limb due to a traumatic accident or like a wartime incident. Modern humans have had to confront, radical changes in their physiologies as a result. And, while it might seem like losing a limb is difficult enough, the way that our nervous system evolved makes the loss of a limb even more disruptive than just the loss of a physical capability. So, muscles do more than just enable us to move and, pick things up and put them down, right? Hey, Deanna, good to see you. Hope all's well. Muscles obviously do that, right? They do enable us to move and lift things up and put them down, and they do that very effectively. But there's more to muscle than just moving things. And so, our nervous system is an important part of our musculature, not only because our central nervous system controls the movement of our voluntary muscles, at least, but because our nervous system depends upon the changes that occur in our muscles as we use them. And so this is one of those things that comes completely naturally to you, right? One of those things that you never really think about, but it's incredibly complicated when you think about the level of coordination that's necessary for me to do something as simple as like pick up this bottle, right? How do you know how much you need to contract your muscles to lift something like a cup or a pen, right? How do you know you're not just going to like catapult it, into the ceiling or through the window, right? Our muscles are more complicated than just, lifting things up and putting them down. They not only receive instructions from our brain, they also provide feedback to our brain in real time all the time. And so, you're lifting something up and you pretty much immediately know how heavy it is, right? As well as how much force you need to exert to lift it. We're not always perfect. Of course, we've all had those moments where, we lift something up that's way lighter than we thought and we're like, whoa, okay. But, assuming we're not talking about like a toddler, we very rapidly figure out, the correct amount of force that's appropriate to accurately handle any given object without either like launching it into the air or damaging our bones by trying to lift it. Thank you very much for the award, Deanna. I really appreciate it. And so it's actually kind of interesting to watch this whole system develop in like a fledgling human, my 2.5-year-old daughter. While some animals are able to navigate their bodies within hours of being born, it takes a very, very long time for humans to figure out the relationship their bodies have with the world. And so why does it take so long for humans to learn how to walk? It's like months at least. And then, when it comes to figuring out how to do things like climbing stairs, jumping, which my daughter is now very into jumping. She loves jumping and skipping. That's like her new thing. Just a little bit terrifying. But then also like things like using forks and spoons. All of that takes kind of an absurdly long time when you think about it, right? And, the whole reason it takes so long is that the relationships between the brain and the body are very complicated. And so, by the way, that relationship, as we keep growing, it changes. And so that's why young adolescents can sometimes be a little bit awkward and a little bit clumsy, right? Our limbs and muscles keep changing in size, changing, freaking out the brain. And so the brain has to continue to recalibrate. It's kind of surreal when you think about it, right? It literally takes years for the brain to become properly calibrated to the body. And so, part of the reason that this relationship is so complicated is that there are literally receptors within our muscles that are sensitive to the muscles being used and how they're being used. And so this is one of our senses that isn't really incorporated into the like classic 5 senses, smell, touch, taste, vision, and hearing. In reality, we have more than 5 senses. Some neuroscientists argue that we have far more than 5 senses, but that whole debate kind of just boils down to semantics at a certain point. So when it comes to our ability to have a sense of how to use our muscles, as well as like where our muscles are in space, this is a sensory system that we call proprioception. And so proprioception refers to your awareness of where various parts of your body are at any given moment. And so, just for example, if you were to close your eyes and keep them closed, right, for like 2 minutes while sitting completely still, which 2 minutes is kind of like a long time when you're doing that. But if you were to keep your eyes closed for 2 minutes and then move your arm in a certain direction, like if you were to like lift it up, right, towards your face or something with your eyes closed, you'd know where your arm was. You know that your arm was up. And most importantly, you don't have to see your arm to know that it's pointing up, right? And so that's proprioception. If someone were to ask you to close your eyes and touch a finger to your nose, right, then your ear, then your chin, right? The only way that you can manage that is via proprioception. It's the very intimate relationship that our brain has with our body. It's our sense of self in space. And the mechanism by which that happens is complicated. And the reason that this is relevant to today's topic is that this whole system is very directly disrupted when we lose a limb. And so, I don't know about you, but this is something that I explored quite a bit when I was a kid, because I was absolutely terrible at falling asleep ever since I was a teenager. And so, I would sort of play around with this. And so I can even sort of like see a kind of shadow or ghost of my hand with my eyes closed and the lights off, I haven't actually seen any research that explores why that might be. And, it would be fun to speculate as to why it might happen if it actually does happen. And it's not completely in my imagination. But anyways, our ability to like competently move our bodies around, without access to our most dominant sensory system, vision, it relies very heavily on this sensory system of proprioception, this network of receptors throughout our muscles and our tendons and our joints that keeps our brain updated regarding what all of those things are doing at any given moment all the time. And so 2B Kelly says, I'm aware I'm interrupting. Not at all. You brought it up though. What are the other senses? Sure. So obviously we have the sort of canonical 5. And so the reason I said that some neuroscientists argue that we have far more than 5 senses, as opposed to like maybe 6 or 7, is that, we are sensitive to things like, let's keep it like, technically maybe the most acceptable, uncontroversial. So you are sensitive to gravity, right? You're sensitive to acceleration or just movement, right? You have like literal sensory organs, just as sophisticated of organs as like, what enable us to hear things, right? Hair cells in our inner ear. You have vestibular organs. You have little buckets of salt water that are inside your ear. They're like right next to the parts of our sensory nervous system that enable us to hear things. They're like little buckets of water with sand in them. It's actually not sand. It's actually calcium carbonate, like the stuff that shells are made out of, little nuggets of calcium carbonate. And we have these little hair cells, just like the ones that enable us to hear, that are tickled as those grains, those little nuggets of shell tumble along those hair cells, right? And so that's how you know that like when you're moving like this, that water has inertia, right? And so that water will sort of tend to stay where it is as you move, right? And so, you're just tickling those hair cells every time you move your head. Same sort of concept as when you're like accelerating in any given direction, right? Those sand, I keep calling it sand, that calcium carbonate, those little nuggets of shell, they have inertia. And so they will tend to stay where they are right when you move. And so you're moving relative to that sand, and that sand then tickles those hair cells as you move, right? And that's why, by the way, if you've ever gotten dizzy, I'm sure we've all gotten dizzy at some point. If you continue spinning in the same direction over and over and over again, now that water is going to begin to move itself, right? It's no longer largely stationary. And so then when you stop turning, that water continues moving and continues tickling those hair cells. And so your brain thinks you're still moving, right? So that's what getting dizzy is. So that's one, let's say that's our sixth sense. But we are also sensitive to barometric pressure, right? Sometimes people can get pretty severe headaches when, the environmental barometric pressure goes up or goes down. We're sensitive to acid, right? We have receptors throughout our body that are sensitive to, certain pH, acidity, essentially, acidity or alkalinity, how, acidic or basic any given, fluid is. Sensitive to that. We're sensitive to, you could technically call this the same thing as touch, but we're sensitive to like pressure within our lungs. What else? Gosh, we're sensitive to, we're sensitive to levels of sugar. I don't know if you want to call that a sensory system technically, but yeah, and you can go on and on. Like I would have to I think I at one point collected a list of senses that some neuroscientists argue. I mean, they're being a little cheeky, to borrow a term from our friends in the United Kingdom, but a list that was like over 20 sensory systems long. And so, I think people are just being a little bit playful when they go that far. But the point is, we definitely do have more than 5 senses. And so the proprioceptive system, that's the one that we're talking about today, that's your sense of body and space, right? That's your ability to detect how heavy any given object is just by lifting it up, right? You don't have to weigh it. You don't know the number, or you don't know the specific weight, but you know the weight relative to your capabilities to lift it. And its weight relative to other objects, right? So it's sort of like you have an inbuilt scale. And so the vestibular system, the proprioceptive system does more than just that, right? It's also, again, how that how I know my arm is up without looking at it or, anything. That's proprioception. And that system is what's, one of the sensory systems that's most directly and severely affected by something like the loss of a limb. And so just like all those other sensory systems, there are also illusions of our proprioceptive system. And so one of the stranger ones is called the Pinocchio illusion. Here, I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see it better. So the Pinocchio illusion is kind of funny. So this is where if you sit behind a friend or whatever, somebody who doesn't mind you touching their face, and you wear a blindfold, and you spend a fair bit of time stroking both your friend's nose in the same exact way as you're stroking, your own nose, you can start to perceive your nose as being gigantic. Like you can start to perceive their nose as being yours. And so, there are other ways to make this happen using something that vibrates on your arm to sort of confuse the whole system. But the point is that this system, just like all of our other sensory systems, the proprioceptive system can be tricked. And unlike some of our other sensory systems, this sensory system is pretty much always on, right? It's constantly updating the brain as to where the body is and what the body's doing. And so, I'm sure you can imagine how this system would be radically affected by something like the loss of a limb or an amputation, right? All of those receptors, that the brain grew up with, right, and developed alongside, constantly listening to the signals from all of them. All those receptors are now gone when you lose a limb. But it's not like those receptors were like, adios, brain, we're out of here, right? Before they left, it's far more abrupt. And, while part of the brain rationally knows that the arm is no longer there, the entire system of proprioception has no way to immediately adapt to the loss of all those signals. And as a result, there can be all kinds of strange, as well as potentially very distressing and painful effects. Wait, why? Oh, I'm not sure to what you're referring. Oh, the Pinocchio illusion. Why does that happen? So, we don't know 100% why it happens, but I think we can pretty accurately speculate that it's very dependent upon you making sure that you do exactly the same movement at the same exact time, right? Because what your brain is doing is tying together the touch, sense of you stroking your own nose and all the movement of your proprioceptive system, right? Everything is the same, except you know, this other person's nose is not yours, right? And so, you know, your brain can begin to be tricked into thinking that what you're feeling, what you're doing to yourself, and what you're feeling on the fingertip of your other hand on the other person's nose is the same thing, right? And it's happened. And so as a result, it's like, oh, well, okay, that's our nose. It's kind of crazy, right? And you know, there are other ways to do this, right? Like where you can have a third person participate, and instead of you, or instead of you know, you either stroking yours or the other person's nose, you know, the third person is doing it. Whatever. There are different iterations of this, and I've actually never experienced it. To be fair, I'll have to try it with my wife. But I mean, it's one of the things that you hear about as you're learning about the proprioceptive system. And so yeah. But I mean, I'm sure you can imagine that, you know, the loss of a limb would pretty severely disrupt this sensory system, and you know, this is like a very abrupt change. And the proprioceptive system has no way of knowing, right? Being aware that all those proprioceptive receptors are gone. And so, you know, for example, you might have heard of a condition called phantom limb syndrome or phantom pain syndrome. So this is a perception of the presence of a limb despite its absence. And, you know, of course, the proprioceptive system is just one of the very many sensory systems that are present in our limbs, right? Heat, cold, pressure, itchiness, proprioception, obviously, as well as, and this is where it becomes particularly unfortunate and disruptive, as well as pain, right? And so in other words, not only is someone adapting their lives to the sudden loss of a limb, they can also feel a persistent sense of pain, or even something like an itch that quite literally cannot be scratched. And so, you know, think about how maddening that would be. And, you know, you rationally know that the limb isn't there, but nonetheless, the sensations persist, right? And so, you know, phantom pain is a whole topic onto itself because it's very interesting, and we don't know precisely the mechanisms underlying phantom pain or phantom limb syndrome, but it's absolutely, it absolutely demonstrates that, you know, the relationships that our brains have with our bodies are far more complicated than just the body being the vessel that moves the brain, right? There's a constant, fully integrated and reciprocal relationship between the two, right? The brain and the body. And when that relationship is substantially altered or just incorrectly calibrated, the outcomes can be very distressful. So how can they be helped? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. So, you know, and just like our other sensory systems, similar to how, you know, there are illusions for all those other sensory systems and, you know, how they can be tricked, our sensory systems can also adapt to new circumstances, right? Our sensory systems, you know, they can grow to perform in ways that they wouldn't normally have performed, or they didn't strictly evolve to. And so that brings us to the innovations that this group is bringing to the biomedical table. So first of all, and this is actually something that I discussed like years ago, like in 2017, but the whole world of amputation, like the way that the actual surgery itself is performed, hasn't really changed all that much for quite a long time, like over 100 years. Like we're talking Civil War, you know, in the United States, like pretty much been the same exact procedure since then. We have better drugs, we have better, you know, analgesics, anesthetics. It's not like it's just whiskey, right? But still, I mean, fundamentally, just like it's like the carpentry that is involved in amputation is pretty much the same. But a while back, this team developed a novel way by which the surgery can be performed. And that technique is called agonist-antagonist myoneural interface, or AMI. And so here is that article. We'll do this and that. Okay. And so the fundamental motivation underlying the application of, you know, this AMI procedure is actually to set someone up to be far more likely to be able to interact with a prosthetic in a far more intuitive way, like in a way where it can actually begin to feel quite a bit more like an actual completely integrated part of their body, rather than feeling more like a cane or a crutch, or, you know, something that's not really a part of the body, but still obviously very, very useful. And so this is a pretty new procedure. Only about like 20 people have undergone the procedure, and I can include a link to an explanation of what it's like to undergo the procedure by someone who is named Lexi Bader. Okay, so she describes like what it's like to have undergone AMI, and, you know, as you can see by the mask that she's wearing, she underwent this procedure fairly recently, right? In her case, she underwent the procedure due to a condition that's called complex regional pain syndrome, which is a condition where there's this sustained pain and inflammation after someone has an injury, right? And it used to have different names, you know, reflex sympathetic dystrophy and causalgia. it's basically a condition where the sensation of pain, there is this sensation of pain, that someone experiences after something as innocuous as like bumping into something, right? Or someone poking them, right? Which clearly would be pretty seriously distressing, right? And so, so yeah, I'm happy to post that link if anybody's interested. But so here is the sort of fundamental concept here. This is an image from the group's original article in 2017 that describes this AMI procedure. And, they're simplifying the whole concept here. But, the whole procedure is based on the relationship that complementary muscles have with each other. Okay. And so think about your biceps, right? Your bicep enables you to move your arm in a specific way, right? And, pick things up in a certain direction, right? And then think about your triceps, right? They enable you to move, to extend your arm all the way, to move things away from you, to push things away from you. They're on opposite sides of the same exact bone, right? Bicep, tricep. And so, whenever you contract your arm at the elbow, bring your hand towards your body, your bicep contracts. For that to even be possible, the triceps have to cooperate, right? And so, similarly to fully extend your arm, making it as long as possible, your bicep also has to cooperate. And by cooperate, what I mean is relax. Right. And so if you look at this little diagram of the muscle, specifically under number 2 in the middle there, that's what it's showing. So one muscle is contracting. It's literally getting smaller. Right. That's the agonist muscle. And for that to happen, the other muscle, the complementary muscle, stretches and relaxes. Right. So, you get an effect like that. And so, given the gives the contracting muscle sort of the space and freedom to get shorter. So that's the antagonist, the one that's stretching out. Agonist, antagonist. And so it's kind of wild to think about how complicated and like perfectly choreographed that all has to be for you to be able to do something as simple as, pick up a bottle of water and take a sip, right? You never even have to think about it. In fact, you probably never even thought about it at all, right? And there's actually a method of stretching that is also based on this whole complementary muscle relationship, right? The agonist-antagonist muscle relationship. And it's called reciprocal inhibition stretching. It's sometimes also called active stretching in the fitness community. Same idea. And so the idea is that if you want to stretch one muscle, you keep its complementary muscle, its opposite or antagonist muscle in mind as well. So you're stretching, you're not only focusing on the one muscle you're trying to stretch. So let's stretch our triceps, right? So normally you just do something like this, right? Which, classic tricep stretch. And it helps, it stretches the triceps for sure. That's called static stretching, okay? With reciprocal inhibition stretching, or stretching using the same fundamental premise as the AMI surgical procedure, you're actually going to actively contract your bicep while stretching your tricep, right? You're actively contracting the bicep. And so it's a little strange, but because of that neurophysiological relationship between these muscles, your brain actively inhibits your triceps when your bicep is contracting. Just like, in that simplified cartoon of those muscles, right? It enables you to achieve an even greater stretch as a result, right? Because the brain is actively inhibiting, relaxing the tricep, enabling you to stretch it more. Hello from Frederick. Hey, what's up, Tim? Thanks for jumping in. So yeah, reciprocal inhibition stretching for any, exercise nerds out there can be pretty helpful. Particularly when you're like, really, really sore. But anyways, so that's the fundamental concept and procedure that drove this team to develop, this improved surgical procedure. And the major benefit is that at the end of recovery, the person's nervous system is in a significantly better position to have a largely intact nervous system following the procedure. And so instead of having the muscles severed, right, such that the agonist-antagonist muscle pairs, like the relationships between the bicep and the triceps, instead of just severing them and it's all over, right? With this AMI procedure, these muscles and the neurophysiological relationship between them, they're still able to interact with one another, okay? And so here's a quote from the senior author on that initial publication from 2017. So, quote, using this framework, the patient will not have to think about how to control their artificial limb. When a patient imagines moving their phantom limb, signals will be sent through nerves to the surgically constructed muscle pairs. Implanted muscle electrodes will then sense these signals for the control of synthetic motors in the external prostheses. We think that because the brain is so good at remapping and it's so plastic, it will quickly adapt to knowing how much it has to contract each muscle graft for natural prosthetic control. Pretty cool. So in other words, the team is basically, is taking that source of significant suffering for a really substantial proportion of people, right? Phantom limb syndrome. They're taking it and they're making it an asset. and enabling people to more effectively interact with a prosthetic. And so without this augmentation of the surgical procedure, people who undergo amputation have no way to have their proprioceptive system meaningfully interface with a prosthetic. And without that system, they really just have to visually focus on the movement of the prosthetic to precisely control the subtler, more precise movements. And so the way they get this to work is by making sure that that whole agonist-antagonist, that whole reciprocal inhibition relationship between muscles, they're making sure that those relationships are intact at the end of the procedure. And so, I don't have to watch my own arm, to lift this bottle to my mouth. I can rely entirely on my proprioceptive system, right? Certainly, it's just one of those things that you take for granted until there's a problem with that. But anyway, so this team is basically exploiting the fact that we're even capable of experiencing phantom limb syndrome and using it to our advantage when it comes time for a particularly advanced prosthetic device to be used. So that brings us to the wonderful progress that this team in Massachusetts has made. Here we go. Oh, yeah. And so one of the interesting things that this team demonstrated is, so when someone is placed in an fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, it's basically this giant device that can reveal which parts of the brain are consuming energy, right, as a proxy for which parts of the brain are becoming active moment to moment. Okay, and when they placed people who had lost limbs in an fMRI and they were asked to move their phantom limbs, there was activity in the part of the brain that would normally be recruited by that proprioceptive system, the system that updates the brain on where various parts of our body are. And so in other words, despite the absence of the limb, it's not there. It was purely the phantom limb that was producing those neuronal reactions within the brain that would normally depend upon the presence of the limb. And so when it comes to this project, the brain seemed like it was sort of absolutely ready to accept that sensory input once again. And if, when a limb is lost, the surgical procedure is performed in that, precisely that precise way, that AMI procedure, if it's performed that way, that preserves those physiological relationships between the muscles that are still there, an advanced prosthetic device might very well deliver just that sensory information. And so to give you a sense of how advanced the device can be, here is, boom. Okay, so this is a video demonstrating a very early stage of a prosthetic device that can interface with an intact proprioceptive system. And so, you can see here, this gentleman is literally controlling his prosthetic hand purely via a mechanism that's detecting activity in a part of his arm that would ultimately connect to the prosthetic, right? Even opening and closing fingers purely by thinking about doing so just as naturally as those of us who are lucky to not have lost limbs do, right? So at this point, the limitations are in enabling finer control of the subtler movements of our hands. One of the glories of human evolution, by the way, those subtler movements that our hands can perform, that manual dexterity. So this gentleman, by the way, a veteran of combat in Iraq, he was severely injured in an explosion from an IED in 2005. And I do recommend checking out that article. It's free. That describes his experience in greater detail. But he had been confronting chronic, sustained pain in his right hand, which was severely injured, but still largely intact. And also, that was also the hand that would ultimately interface with this prosthetic. And so he had undergone multiple surgeries to address the pain, which never ultimately panned out, never really effectively addressed the pain. We're talking dozens of surgeries. And so his physicians brought up the possibility of amputation to address that persistent pain. A pretty significant thing to which he would have to commit, of course, right? And then just 2 months later, he started working with this. He underwent the procedure. And just 2 months later, he started working with this novel prosthetic, right? He had undergone that AMI surgical procedure, that special surgical procedure. This may be the most evocative half-stream title ever. Well, yeah. No one's accused me of using unprovocative titles. Anyway, so we will get to being able to potentially feel through these prosthetic devices. And so, you can see that this gentleman right here, same guy, is learning how to control individual fingers, right, and the tilt of the wrist, and moving them by volition alone. And that's what makes this whole surgical procedure, as well as the prosthetic device itself, right? The control of the prosthetic device is controlled entirely by the same kinds of thoughts that you and I have, right, when moving our own hands. And just as importantly, his persistent pain, the entire motivation to undergo this procedure in the first place, that persistent pain was also gone, Okay. So yeah, of course there's a learning process, right? While the brain becomes acquainted with its new limb, essentially, which by the way, and I imagine a lot of people don't realize this, but we all undergo precisely that process with our brain learning to control its body. Right. So watching my 2.5-year-old daughter learn to sort of calibrate her movements to achieve various goals, like everything from things as simple as learning to turn her head in the direction of someone who's speaking to her, right? It kind of takes a while for that system to come on board to develop, but then also to learning how to turn her body over, right? That's like one of the first sort of landmarks, developmental landmarks that all infants have to figure out. It's like one of those things that like parents will sit and just like watch and wait to see if they can figure it out. Takes quite a bit of time, but then also, learning how to walk, learning how to manipulate a fork and spoon, running and jumping, all that takes quite a bit of time. And all of that time is devoted to growing and refining the exact same parts of the brain that are recruited when someone has undergone this surgical procedure is learning how to use one of these prostheses, right? And so in the stat article, the journalist also retells a story from another person. And this is where we get to being able to potentially feel through these prosthetic devices. So they have a quote from another person who'd undergone that same AMI surgical procedure, right? That special amputation procedure. And so here's a quote from the article, quote, "One AMI amputee was hiking recently while wearing a standard prosthetic and stepped into a creek. He later described having the sensation of water flowing over his prosthetic foot, even though it had no way to perceive that. He trusted or embodied his prosthetic more than someone who doesn't have this phantom sensation," end quote. So in other words, he has a prosthetic, at least foot, maybe leg. And it's, a conventional one. It has no, sensory receptors, but he could still have those sensory experiences. And so, despite the complete absence of any sensory receptors that, normally be required to be aware of water flowing over the skin, this person's brain was perceiving that sensation nonetheless. Almost certainly, because he'd undergone that unique surgical procedure, that AMI procedure, and an experience like this, reveals quite a bit about the nature of those sensory systems, that they don't rely entirely upon the sensory receptors themselves, right? For example, but it's a remarkable demonstration of how important the physiological relationships between, the muscles and the nervous system that control them are to the way that we perceive the world and how we move through it and how we perceive ourselves, right? And so this team is currently working on improving and sort of refining the capabilities of these prostheses, enabling even finer control of its movement with some really fancy engineering using like tiny little magnets. Pretty cool. But anyways, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty excited and grateful that, people are working on developing such sophisticated devices. And I can't help but consider a future where, once this technology achieves a certain level of progress, I can't help but wonder what it'll be like when there are prosthetic devices that are unambiguously and overtly superior to the parts of the human body that they're intended to replicate or replace, right? And from what I can tell, we're not too far away from that state of affairs. All right. That's what I have for you today. If you dig this kind of discussion, things like neuroscience, biomedical science, stuff like that, maybe you'll consider subscribing and liking and doing all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. And thanks for watching. But okay, hey, Gemma, thanks for hopping in. That excitement when your child has rolled over, totally. It's also a huge relief. So for anybody who hasn't, had kids, that's like, there's this thing that, all parents have to deal with called SIDS, or at least confront. We don't all necessarily have to deal with it, thankfully, but sudden infant death syndrome. And there are almost certainly a whole wide variety of potential causes of it. And in some cases, it's not something that you can potentially prevent, really. It's just like a quirk of the nervous system. But it can also be because, the babies turn over and their face is like on the floor or, in the crib. And they haven't learned how to get back over, and so their breathing is obstructed, right? It's pretty scary because you can't have your eyes on the baby 100% of the time, even though in our case we kind of necessarily had to about 98% of the time because she refused to fall asleep without us physically touching her. So yeah, it is sort of like yes. There's a bunch of funny kind of examples of that. Like my daughter is just now mastering the potty using a big girl potty, which is very, you're sort of like, yes, you peed. It's sort of a ridiculous, you sort of know it's ridiculous when you're reacting that way, but you do it anyways. Sorry if you mentioned it already. Does this do anything for chronic pain? Absolutely, Tim. Yeah. So I did earlier on, likely before you hopped in, but simply speaking, so this gentleman who underwent this prosthetic or underwent this surgical procedure that I was talking about, the agonist-antagonist myoneural interface, AMI surgical procedure, that is like a special way to sever a limb, right? Because it's damaged, or potentially because they're experiencing chronic pain and nothing is working. And basically the surgical procedure just makes it so that the neurophysiological relationships between complementary muscles, agonist, antagonist, right? Where, your bicep and your triceps, for example, you have that kind of relationship between muscles all throughout your body, right? That neurophysiological relationship is kept intact. And so this gentleman, he suffered a pretty severe series of injuries due to an IED blast in Iraq in 2005. And his hand, the hand that ultimately is now interacting with this prosthetic device, it was very, very severely injured, but it was still there. I think he had lost some fingers, but he still had his hand. And he had this chronic and severe pain, and he had undergone dozens of surgeries. And obviously, painkillers were used. He really, really wanted to avoid using opioid painkillers. And then at a certain point, his physicians recommended, we could try amputation, which up until very, very, very recently has never really been considered an option like that. Like, generally speaking, it's sort of like a last case scenario that someone would undergo an amputation, right? For obvious reasons. And as I said earlier, it's largely because the procedure really has stayed unchanged since like the Civil War in the United States, right? The only big differences are that we have better analgesics, better painkillers, and better anesthetics. It's not just whiskey, like it was back then. But anyways, so he underwent this procedure for just that reason. Another example is this woman whose name is Lexi Bader. So she underwent this AMI surgical procedure because she had complex regional pain syndrome. And so basically she had this severe, if you're unfamiliar with that, it's not exactly chronic pain. It is a sort of pain related condition where somebody just basically becomes like hyperalgesic, like very, very sensitive to innocuous touch, right? So usually it's after an injury. But what can happen is that, the now healed, but injured limb, experiences this very, very severe pain reaction and inflammatory reaction when somebody just bumps into them, or they bump into something and wouldn't normally really hurt very much at all, but they have this tremendous reaction, right? And you can imagine that can be extremely disruptive. And so she underwent this AMI procedure, and you can tell pretty recently, right? She's wearing a mask for reasons that are all pretty familiar to us these days. So yes. It is still very, very new, though. This AMI procedure, I think only about 20 people have undergone this procedure. And obviously only certain surgeons are familiar with it. Specifically, this team at Massachusetts General Hospital. It's one of the best hospitals in the country. I don't know, maybe the best, certainly among the top. It's called Massachusetts General Hospital. Sounds kind of like a mundane name for a hospital, but they do a ton of research there. I think the veteran that I was showing before actually had it performed at Walter Reed, obviously also a very, very excellent hospital. My point being, you can't just like go to your primary care physician and just like ask. But if progress continues to be made and they continue demonstrating that this surgical procedure not only has benefits for rendering people more prepared to accept more sophisticated prosthetic devices, but also mitigates the likelihood that they'll experience phantom limb syndrome, phantom pain syndrome. I should also mention that the veteran, he underwent that procedure, and after the procedure, after he healed, obviously, the pain was gone. And he didn't have phantom limb syndrome or anything or he didn't have phantom pain syndrome or anything like that. So yes, that's the long way to answer your question with yes. Also, by the way, Lexi Bader, she wrote an explanation of what living, what healing from the procedure is like, what life is like afterwards. Here, let me just get the link for you. Here we go. So, explanation. Yeah, here we go. I can just post it. Right. Yeah. So yeah, well, I think that pretty much gets to the context, the prospect of potentially this kind of a procedure addressing some of the most difficult chronic pain. There really is no good treatment for chronic pain. We have opioids that are helpful, obviously, but opioids aren't actually very good for treating most kinds of pain. And obviously we become, tolerant. We develop tolerance very, very rapidly, and in some cases, and a chemical dependence or substance dependence, and in some cases, an addiction, right? Do I think that this procedure is going to be one of the frontline treatments for chronic pain? No, I don't think so. I think it is a very, very significant, procedure, right? But yeah, something like this will almost certainly be on the table in the armamentarium of physicians. Gemma says, my dad's twin brother, before he passed, always had his leg, passed away, had his leg amputated, but would always complain about a pain in the leg he didn't have. Yeah. Yeah, they said it was phantom pain. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. And phantom pain is obviously very, very unpleasant, but there's also things like phantom itch. Like imagine that, an itch isn't obviously as bad as pain, right? But imagine having an itch that you quite literally physically cannot scratch because there's nothing for you to scratch. Right? There are some really interesting treatments for phantom limb syndrome that involve basically tricking the brain into tricking the proprioceptive system into realizing that there is no leg, using like mirrors and stuff like that. But instead of having to deal with that, if we can just make this surgical procedure, this AMI surgical procedure for amputation, more ubiquitous, it's very likely that phantom pain syndrome would be far less common. But the cool thing about it is that it actually it exploits phantom limb syndrome. It doesn't get rid of it, right? Because as the person who was describing his experience using a conventional leg prosthetic device, no sensory receptors, he was walking in through a creek, and he stepped in the creek, and he had the sensory perception of water flowing over his foot that isn't a foot, right? Or it isn't it isn't the foot with which he was born, right? And so basically what this group is doing is taking phantom limb syndrome and making an asset, exploiting it. Really cool. Frank says, interesting info as always, expertly explained. You should train other doctors' communications. Well, thank you very much, Frank. I really appreciate that. All right. Yeah. Thanks everybody for hopping in. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. And if you haven't, maybe you'll consider subscribing and liking and doing all that kind of stuff wherever you're watching. Otherwise, I will see you next week.